Hello everyone and welcome back once again to my channel. Today I'm going to be teaching you, again, how to make an awesome mosaic with your old or unwanted Yu-Gi-Oh cards. So, to start out, the very first thing you need, of course, is Yu-Gi-Oh cards to start out with. And I've got all these cheap holos that I got for about 10 cents each at my local card shop. I'm not going to cut up those E-heroes. I think I'm going to throw those in my binder just because I like the elemental heroes. But anyways, next thing you need, pencil, X-Acto knife, eraser, scissors, some X-Acto blades, a ruler, and some double-sided tape. And last but not least is this sort of like card-sized watercolor paper. Doesn't really matter what kind of paper it is, I don't think, but I always use watercolor paper. So now we're going to start probably the most important phase of any of the phases of this whole thing, other than the laying in of the actual mosaic itself, and that is the sketch phase. Now, people undervalue sketching very often, and as an artist who's been doing this stuff for a while now, like creating art pieces in general, not these mosaics, these are pretty new, but just having experience doing art, I can confidently say that your sketch phase is the most important phase and you should really spend some time on it. You really need to make sure you get everything right in the sketch phase, even if it's just rough. You want to make sure the measurements themselves are relatively accurate, because if they are not, you will end up, for example, in this case, if I hadn't taken measurements, I would have ended up with a very, very lopsided triangle or a pyramid. And you guys will too, most likely, unless you have just a brilliant eye and can eye out things perfectly. But if you're a human being, I would say that's very unlikely, unless you're some sort of savant or something. In that case, congratulations. But for most of us, that's not the case. And it's really important to take measurements and make sure you are getting things right in the sketch phase before you move on and do anything permanent, because this is the stage where, you know, you can make mistakes, you can erase, you can correct things, and you want to make corrections wherever it's necessary. Don't be lazy. Do not be lazy. Anyways, I'm going to get into some of the markers now, so I'm just kind of laying in the various different base colors and separating the different areas just so I can see them well when I eventually do the mosaic portion of this, and kind of just roughly deciding, like, okay, I want this to be about this value or about this color, so it has, you know, some sort of planning done. It's especially important when you're doing a custom piece like this and you don't have, you know, really reference material other than, for example, for me, the Millennium puzzle. And I'm not really sure what I'm going to do with the background, but I just decided to kind of lay in some golden rays coming out, because I sort of figure that I want to have an emanation coming off of the Millennium puzzle to sort of draw your eyes into the puzzle, and also to have areas of less detail throughout the piece. I'm cutting up the pieces now for the outline that I'm going to do. A lot of Yu-Gi-Oh cards don't have really outlines, at least black outlines around them, but I choose to do this because in my very first piece that I made, I didn't, and it created the issue of not being able to distinguish the foreground from the background, because the values are often so similar in Yu-Gi-Oh cards of the cards. And when I say values, for people who are not initiated in art or have not had much training, values means the darkness or brightness of a color or shade or hue or whatever. Essentially, it's how much black or white is mixed into a color, and that amount of black or white determines the value of said color. And so the thing about Yu-Gi-Oh cards and various other card games is the majority of them, at least the modern cards, a lot of the other the older cards had a lot more variation in value and saturation and so forth, but a lot of the modern cards are quite similar, and I think it's just that way to create like a cohesiveness between the different styles of cards. Since there's so many different styles within Yu-Gi-Oh, at the very least, the one thing they choose to do is to keep the values and colors relatively similar. And while I can appreciate that within the context of the card game, it does make things a little bit difficult when making these art pieces, because it's hard to find the right color or value that you're looking for. So sometimes you have to compromise and actually use a color or value that you weren't planning on using originally. Anyways, as you can see here, I've just laid down the double-sided tape on the card, and I'm cutting off the excess around the edges. And now I'm pulling off the protective sort of layering on the tape here of this wax paper sort of stuff. And that will allow the sticky side to be exposed, which will allow me to start laying things in. By the way, I don't know if you guys noticed the Band-Aid on my finger, but I cut myself pretty bad while I was doing this, so be extra careful. Anyways, here's the outline. I'm starting to put it in. This time, thankfully, since there are long, flat edges on this piece, I can actually utilize the cards themselves in long strips rather than in tiny pieces as I usually have to do on outlines. And that really helps to keep the outline a very consistent width and make it look extra nice, which, you know, is important. We want this thing to look as good as possible. We put a lot of effort into these pieces, and they take a lot of time because not only do you have to draw, but you have to then do the mosaic portion, and it's not easy. There's a lot of cutting that goes on and all sorts of other things. So I choose this kind of purplish color here because I really like the little like kind of lines of lighter purples and darker purples that run through it, and I feel it will give a nice contrast when compared to the golden Millennium puzzle here. So I really try to think about that sort of thing when I'm making these pieces. You want to have contrast as much as possible, because of the fact that there really just isn't that much native or natural contrast within the cards themselves. You kind of have to create it yourself by finding the right cards to apply to certain situations. And I just start laying in parts of this background here, kind of trying to figure out exactly what I want it to look like. And I think I found something cool here with this almost marbled looking texture that you can find on, I believe these are synchro monsters. Anyways, I'm just gonna let this run and I'll catch up with you guys in a minute. Okay, now it's time to get into one of the most fun parts and also one of the most difficult parts of the project, which is cutting up and laying in some of the beautiful hollow of the Millennium puzzle. Now, something to keep in mind when you're doing this stuff, guys, is that even within hollows, you need to think about the darks and lights that you're working with here to make sure that the shadows and light are relatively consistent. At least they don't need to be perfect. I know it's not easy to get them perfect, but and in some cases it's impossible depending on what hollows you have available to you. But you know, it's important that the darks and lights apply no matter where you go in the piece, because otherwise you just end up with a blob, right? It's just going to end up being one color and just this huge blob of that one color, and you won't be able to tell what's what. So as you can see, I'm laying in the darker portions of the hollow on the shadowy areas here, and it's hard to tell if they're hollow, but they are. And the lighter portions of the hollow in the lighter areas. It's really quite simple. It doesn't need to be perfect. Doesn't need to have like a huge gradient of hollow or anything like that. It just needs to be consistent enough to where you can tell what's what, because otherwise, like I said, you just end up with nothing at the end. One big shape with, you know, no detail in it. You don't have the eye anymore. You don't have the different little crevices around the Millennium puzzle. You don't have the three-dimensionality of it. It just kind of falls apart. Anyways, I will catch you guys in a little bit once this part of the process is done. Okay, so I've got the main portion of the Millennium puzzle pretty much done now. I'm just laying in some tiny final details, and then I start to work on the rest of the portions of the white of the background that I still haven't done yet, this sort of marbled white. And after that, I'm going to add in those areas that are currently colored yellow that I had set up with the marker before. I'm thinking they're going to be some sorts of, I don't know, almost like rays of light emanating from the Millennium puzzle. And so I start to layer in some different pieces of yellowish and kind of tannish portions of cards, which I have cut up in preparation for this, and also add some tiny little hollow pieces that I have left over from the Millennium puzzle gold stuff that I was cutting up off the other card. And those pieces of the gold hollow foil will work really well to create a sort of sparkling effect within the light beams which are emanating from the Millennium puzzle. Okay, so the entire background of the piece is now completed, and so I start to measure these colored hollow portions and place them in the area at the bottom here. These are going to sort of represent almost a prism effect of like glass or similar thing, sort of like what Pink Floyd did with one of their famous album covers. And so that's what I do. I'll start cutting them up and dropping them in. I just find kind of slivers that work from these different hollows that I have that I got for really cheap, and I cut them up in long pieces and lay them in. Fortunately, this takes a lot less time and is quite a bit easier than basically anything else I've had to do so far. So this finishes up real quick. And boom, it is pretty much done. Now it's time to put some UV resin on this and harden it. Unfortunately, the first UV resin I got was trash, and so I tried using the original UV flashlight that I got for it. It did not cure, as you will see in a moment, and it just ended up kind of bending the card a bit, which really sucked. But yeah, so we just kind of tried to do that pretty unsuccessfully, unfortunately. I mean, you can see it's just not hardening. It's just staying there and kind of progressively folding up. So I put it outside in the sun, hoping that would harden it up, thinking, you know, perhaps that'd work. Didn't, so I bought a better UV light. This one is like for nails and stuff. It's very strong, very potent, and it kind of worked eventually. And this is the finished product. Unfortunately, as you can see, the resin actually did some damage to the thing, so I'm going to have to do some repairs on it later on. But I think it looks pretty cool in spite of that. And fortunately, I've tried using UV resin coating on the very first card that I made, the morphing jar, and it looks phenomenal. So if you go look at my Instagram, it is _hobby_gremlin on Instagram. If you look that up, you'll be able to see the morphing jar, which I've coated with UV resin there, and you'll be able to see how cool UV resin can actually make these things look. It actually made a huge improvement on the original piece. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. Please like, subscribe, and comment if you did, and I'm looking forward to seeing the amazing pieces you guys will make with these techniques in the future. I hope you all have an amazing day. Catch you next time.